Kia ora and welcome to Context. I'm Corin Dan.
And I'm Guy Espiner.
Context is the backstory to the front page story.
We take an issue making headlines today and trace its long shadow to try to figure out how on earth we got to where we are today.
Indeed, but there is a catch. Only one of us knows the topic we're going to be talking about.
We take turns, of course, being fair and balanced, folks. So, Corin, you're up. What are you going to drop on me today?
Well, I'm going to start with a question actually first. Have you, in the course of your esteemed career, Guy Espiner, ever thought, you know what, I've had enough, I'm up in sticks, I'm going to head across the ditch, try my luck overseas?
You know, I haven't. I've had, not an animosity towards Australia, but I've just never considered living there.
Anywhere else?
Britain and the US, and spent a bit of time in both, and worked in Britain. I actually worked as a journalist for a wee while in Britain. I worked for the Sunday Times and the Times, the Murdoch press for a wee while there. So I've considered upping sticks there, but never to Australia.
Interesting. So I think we can say that then you were part of the brain drain at some point, and that might be the hint of what we're doing today. We are looking at the issue of the brain drain from New Zealand. That is the loss of talented people, really, and that's the definition we're going to be talking about today. Talented people, people with skills, leaving the country for greener pastures. Primarily Australia is the focus today because overwhelmingly the vast bulk of people leaving New Zealand for other opportunities is to Australia. I mean, do you know how many people New Zealanders are living in Australia at the moment?
It'd be just shy of 1 million, wouldn't it?
Not quite that many. We're looking at about nearly 700,000, I think, 670,000 New Zealanders who live in Australia. It is the vast bulk of Kiwis who leave this country. And the reason why we're talking about it today is because the numbers have spiked again. Right throughout our history, we've had periods when the numbers of Kiwis bailing to Australia and elsewhere, but mostly Australia, has spiked. And when it does, it starts to become a real thorn in the side of governments. And all governments of all shades have had to deal with this over the years. And in the year to May this year, we saw it spike to a decade-year high. We're talking 30,000. That is a net loss to Australia, which is a fairly typical figure, actually, over the last 20, 30 years. But it hit it was 2012 when it was at those levels. So it's come back into the consciousness, and we're not also getting the huge numbers of migrants sort of filling in on the other end of the scale from other countries to fill in those losses. So we've got, after a very strong period of immigration in recent years, it's dropped right back down to, I think, 14,000 was the net gain. So it's being kind of accentuated a little bit. Now, let's have a little listen to an attack by the opposition in Parliament. And the government, I think, is feeling quite a bit of pressure on this.
Is it the government's growth strategy to grow the number of New Zealanders leaving this country, with 191 New Zealanders leaving every single day, and the number of young qualified people desperately struggling to find a job?
Our job in this government is to make sure that we build a place where Kiwis can work hard and get ahead, that they can live in a community where they feel safe in their homes, their businesses, their communities, their kids get a world-class education, their parents get looked after in healthcare. And I just would say to members in the Labour Party and the Green Party that if you actually, it's a bit ironic when you don't support oil and gas and fast track and construction and getting things done and built. And actually, where do Kiwis go when they go to Australia? They go work in oil and gas and mining. Get on board, support mining, end the oil and gas ban. Let's get it done.
Mining clearly is a big issue when you think of Australians' mining capability. I mean, why do you think, Guy, you would have covered this story over the years.
Oh, yeah.
It digs into the psyche of New Zealanders, and that's why politicians start to get worried. They think, everyone's leaving and everyone's going to forget to turn the lights out and all that sort of thing, don't they?
Well, that's absolutely right. And I distinctly remember in the 2008 campaign when John Key stood in, I think it was Eden Park, and the figure at the time was, 40,000 or so were leaving, and, he presented this as a very emblematic, sort of illustrative sort of example of how many Kiwis were leaving. And do you remember at the time they had I think it was called the 2025 report, and the report, which was leaked to me actually, if you want to go into that.
I am going to go into that.
Yeah, and it was quickly knocked out of the water. But this idea was to catch up to the incomes that Australia has. Now, I'm not sure you'll have the figures here, but something like New South Wales has, salaries 35% higher than New Zealand. So, look, it's a massive political issue because of the confluence of things, because it's so bloody easy to go to Australia, because you have a shared workforce, but also because you've got that competitive streak, right? So much so that, we feel a sense of competition, and we feel a sense of loss, I suppose.
Absolutely. I think you've summed up a lot of the things excellently that we are going to cover today, and I'll hold you to the location for that John Key comment you mentioned there in the 2007
Was it the
election.
Cape Town, brother?
You might have to rethink. We'll get to that one. We'll keep that one up our sleeve because the location is interesting. And it is the important point to make here, as we're going to go back through the history of when there have been these spikes in numbers leaving and where it's caused this sense, I wouldn't say moral panic, but it's caused us anxiety about, is New Zealand falling behind? Are we going in the right direction? And politicians seize on that. So it's not a new phenomenon. It really isn't, although it's become more prominent certainly in the last 50 or so years. But I want to test your memory on something here. There's one quote which stands above all other quotes when it comes to the brain drain in New Zealand. Now, I referred to this on Morning Report a few weeks back, and it's a famous one. Does anything jump to you?
Yeah, what jumps to me is that New Zealanders leaving to Australia raise the IQ of both countries. And that was Robert Muldoon. I don't know. Do you want a date? Am I right?
You are right. You're absolutely right. But there's a fish hook in this. Keep going.
Was this? I'm trying. Most of my New Zealand-Australia relations sort of is it before the underarm bowl or after it?
It's probably around then, and it's actually quite
1981, 1980.
Yeah, I would say that it's actually a little bit hard to pinpoint. But here's the interesting thing:
did he not actually say it?
Well, he did say it by all accounts. It's very difficult to find any record, and our producer William and I both had a look for this. It is a great line because it really, and he was using it under pressure because Kiwis were leaving in big numbers to Australia at that point. And there was a number of factors behind that. The economy was weak, but also some travel, some rules around the ability to work in Australia. But I'll get to that. But this quote is very interesting. So anyway, I make this comment. I said on air on Morning Report that quote. Get a text from our old mate Mark Sainsbury, former One News political editor, and he says to me, hey, actually, it wasn't Muldoon's quote to begin with. Muldoon apparently used it, and it's become one of these sort of massive quotes. It was actually this person, and you can guess the voice, and we'll talk about him afterwards, but let's play the clip. I spoke to him earlier this week.
Well, years and years ago, I read The Queer Fellow, a novel by Brendan Behan. And in that novel, Brendan Behan talked about when the Irish go to America, it raises the IQ of both countries. And then when the brain drain started in New Zealand, I modified it without attribution. I didn't give Brendan the credit. I took it all myself. I said, when Kiwis go to Australia, it raises the IQ of both countries. And I put it in the listener column. Then about 10 days later, Muldoon quoted it, acted as though it was his quote, but it wasn't. It was mine. I'd already stolen it, so I couldn't get too pious. Longy stole a line of mine as well. It wasn't just Muldoon. In Longy's farewell valedictory to Parliament, he said, Winston Peter can't be here today. He's been unavoidably detained by a full-length mirror.
It still makes me laugh.
That's got to be Tom Scott.
None other than Tom Scott.
Who was also, of course, famously banned from Robert Muldoon's press conferences, wasn't he?
Yeah, we should explain to New Zealanders who aren't familiar. I mean, he is one of the legends.
He's a genius, isn't he? I mean, I worked at the Evening Post. It was my first real daily newspaper journalism job, and he was a famous cartoonist there. And you would, so we'd roll in about 7 a.m, and first deadline was 9:30, and annoy noise of this newsroom and the clattering of the keyboards would rise in this sort of crescendo. And in the corner, Tom's got to be scribbling away because he had to do a cartoon every day. Absolute genius. And you remember walking around the Beehive, Corrin, and the ministerial offices in Bowen House too. The politicians loved it, even when he took the absolute piss out of them. They framed these cartoons, and there were some absolute classic cartoons. Probably as famous one I remember was the day after the snap election was called by Muldoon, and Muldoon wakes up with the wife in bed and goes, "Did I say something about a snap election last night?"
Yeah.
So he had great cartoons, but not only was he absolutely brilliant cartoonist, but he was a fantastic writer and a real genius, and obviously created some good lines too.
Yeah, and it was just before we move on, what was interesting too was he said to me he was so chuffed that Muldoon had said it. Because it was at that point, this was at the period when he had been booted out of the press gallery post-cabinet conference. He was really going after Muldoon, but he was so pleased that he realised that Muldoon was reading his columns in The Listener. So he was like, wow. And that was a pivotal moment for him. But it's interesting because Muldoon, as I say, Muldoon was using that line to push back on the public pressure that was coming on because there was a big spike in this brain drain to Australia. The economy's under pressure. The Australian economy is doing better at this point in the late 70s, early 80s. The other issue was that the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement was signed. That was actually signed a little bit, was it 83? I'll come to that in a minute. But you had this whole worry about New Zealanders going to Australia and being Bondi bludgers and sitting on the beach and getting the dole.
Which was never true, to be fair, to New Zealanders. As most immigrants will tell you, they work harder usually than anyone else.
Absolutely. And before I'm going to go back to right to the beginning when we first started seeing it. But just before I do that, I want to emphasise this point to people listening about how politicians have reacted when they're under pressure, because I've got a couple of quotes that I thought I might give you. So there was old... there was, here we go, I found it now. There was Muldoon saying, coming up with this great one-liner that he took off Tom Scott, pushing back. Compare that, because it's been brain drains all around the world when you think about it. There's the UK, in Ireland, all these sorts of places.
They've got a big diaspora, haven't they?
There was a big one, obviously, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Yep. And the Khomeini... Ruhollah Khomeini is quoted here in 1980 is talking about the brain drain, dismissed concerns, calling them, this is the people who left, as scientists primarily, decayed brains, stating, let these decayed brains flee. Do not mourn them. Is every brain with what you call science in it honourable? So that was a pretty strong way of saying see you later. But one little bit before I move on, Helen Clark, when she was under pressure over this issue in 2000, took a completely different approach. And it's quite interesting. She just said, I'll never discourage young people from looking for opportunities overseas because I believe most will come back. Which is a really interesting flip on it.
Well, it is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that was around about the time that the Howard government started to take away social security rights for New Zealanders over in Australia, which... I don't know, and there was a sort of a double-edged thing there because there was some thought that might make it less attractive for.
I know you did right.
New Zealanders
and that was 2001, and that was that period there was a significant period, and we'll get to that. But let's go back. I want to go back in time, and because if we go back to the beginning of sort of colonisation in New Zealand, if you like, we go back to sort of the 1880s when people start coming from England and there's Australians and there's Irish and all sorts of people arriving in Aotearoa, New Zealand. At that point, you would probably say it wasn't a brain drain, more of a brain exchange between the two countries. And in fact, it seemed as though probably whichever country had found gold that week was probably the one that was getting most people. Now, we've got a little clip here from the New Zealander newspaper.
If shepherds ran off to the diggings, it's only because a lump of gold is worth more than, perhaps, a year's wages. The flockmasters are entitled to any reasonable aid which the government can give them, but they have no claim to an artificial protection in the labour market against more attractive kinds of industry.
Yes, well, I think we recognise that voice,
I
don't
thought
we?
you were going to ask me who that is. I thought, that's Giles Beckford from RNC.
He's not quite that old. Wonderful Giles Beckford. Wonderful Giles Beckford. So it was kind of like this in those early days. And the other thing to remember there, that in those early days, the economies were actually probably fairly similar in terms of the wages and the wealth. But I want to ask you a quick pop quiz question.
Oh, no.
What year did New Zealand finally bite the bullet and decide actually, because the option was there, to join the Australian Federation, but we chose not to?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I did know that we had that option.
I think we still do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like being the 51st state or something, isn't it? It hasn't gone down terribly well between America and Canada.
About that one.
That's right.
Yep.
Do you know, I would probably guess around the turn of the century, around 1900.
Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, bang on. No, it was 1900, 1901.
Oh,
so
that's pretty good, wasn't it?
Very good.
Do I get points for that?
You get points for that. I'm giving you a tick for that.
Yeah.
Premier Richard Seddon, and the interesting thing before I move on, he was under some pressure, and he stalled and held a royal commission of inquiry.
Did he?
To look into it. It gave him a bit of breathing space to basically see what people thought, and then decided that nope, we would go it alone, and we would not be with Australia. Although I'm pretty sure there's sort of like an open-ended clause there.
Yeah, I don't want to derail you, but there have been. I mean, there was a live story for quite a bit of my early journalism career where there's this talk of a common currency.
Yeah,
and especially when the European experiment started and they had a shared common currency, there was a lot of talk about sharing common currency with Australia. Haven't heard that for a while.
Well, no, and it crossed my mind when I was talking to the Prime Minister earlier in the week about he was talking about after having met with Albanese and saying they wanted to synchronise IDs and driver's licence, and I almost squeezed that one out and thought it hasn't been talked about for a while. But I think it was kind of the end, people didn't want it, did they?
Yeah, no, they didn't. But it used to be, I can't remember exactly what year, but it used to be that you didn't need a passport to go to Australia.
Correct,
didn't
yes.
it?
Yes.
And, that you could just rock on off the plane and just
and there have been attempts there has been talk of bringing back, friction, they call it frictionless travel.
Yeah.
So we get on past the 1900s, and actually both countries are trucking along reasonably well. There's ups and downs, there's, fluctuations in the economy and wars and all those sorts of things. But broadly speaking, it doesn't appear that there's a huge amount of brain drain to Australia in those years, except for when we get to about the 1960s. And this is actually quite interesting because this is the first reference that was detected in New Zealand newspapers about the term brain drain. Here's a little clip that we've come up with as well. Have a listen to this. This is from the NZPA 1964. Talk about scientists.
The immediate and obvious effect of inadequate salaries for New Zealand scientists is a continual brain drain, a loss of talent from the government service, much of the best of it overseas.
Yes, and I was thinking about this. There's one very famous New Zealand scientist, of course, we lost, but it was a lot earlier than that.
Yeah, we lost Rutherford, didn't we?
Indeed.
And who did a lot of his work at Oxford, wasn't it? Or Cambridge? I think it was Oxford.
And what's interesting about that is I came across a New York Times story from the 60s which was actually the UK complaining about losing scientists to the US in a brain drain. So you start to get the sense that these things are quite circular. The one country loses people to one place and the next place and the next place. And that is a bit of a theme here with the brain drain when we start to sort of try and think, well, what is the brain drain? So here's the interesting part. We get to the 1970s, and we've talked about a little bit about this already, and it's clear this is when things really change. Really change. I've got graphs and I'm looking at them, and you can just sort of see this the lines both with wages, Australia moving ahead of that 20-30% gap that you talked about, starts to emerge in the late 70s to early 80s.
But I'm just wondering, where does CER pick into that? That this is closer economic relations. It was pretty much the first New Zealand free trade agreement, and I think that was signed around 1980, 1981, wasn't it?
I checked that. That was 86 CER. So
was it that late?
Yes. So the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement was 73. I'll come to that. I'll just jump ahead to that. Yeah. So it is important to talk about these, and there's two threads to this context. One of them is the clear jump in the economy of Australia, the living standards of Australia, the wages of Australia, around that period of the 70s, early 80s. New Zealand stagnated. It is so obvious in all of the graphs. We came out of the wool boom, we crashed, we couldn't recover. You had Muldoon trying to think big, all these things. Our economy just stalls.
Yeah,
and slips behind Australia.
And off the back of the 1973
EEC.
EEC, the European Economic Community, where we used to sell, what was it, maybe 70, 80%, maybe more. I can't remember the exact figures, but we were basically Britain's farm right up into that point. So we took a massive hit on that, didn't we? In a way that Australia didn't.
And that number of net loss of New Zealanders who start going. And we can pinpoint that to a couple of things, as we've talked about. The economy. Our economy, it runs into troubled waters. The Australians sort of plough on a little bit better. They had a different wool type, apparently, which helped them. It was fine wool, and they didn't suffer as much as us, apparently. Luckily, they really are the lucky country. They, of course, also started to move into things like mining and those sort of areas, which was a real draw card. So that period was very significant. And then we get to that issue of the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, which basically was an agreement that allowed New Zealanders and Australians, so it goes both ways, to visit, live and work in each other's countries without restriction, and it also allowed those Kiwis to go to Australia and collect the dole and other benefits. Now, this led to a surge of Kiwis heading across the ditch. Between 1976 and 82, you got 103,000 New Zealanders settled permanently in Australia.
Wow.
And that is why Muldoon came under huge pressure.
Yeah.
You know, and that was a significant jump. So
at that point, right through to about 2001, you got full social security benefits, did you?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
They brought in... So I was trying to dig on this, and I would have loved to have gone deeper into doing a thesis or something, but it appeared as though Muldoon actually put some pressure or tried to lobby the Australians to bring in a stand-down period. Because he was so worried. And they did. They brought in a 6-month stand-down period for the dole, and then a 2-year stand-down period, and it's related to your residency. But effectively, it didn't really stop it. You know, once people, I think probably, and the other thing would have been just being able to get on a plane and the ability to go.
Well, that's true too, Because it's at that point. I mean, travel has been, plane travel has advanced incredibly. You're not having to get the boat. Everything becomes that much easier, right?
Absolutely. I actually had 3 uncles who left in the 70s from Christchurch.
Wow.
One on my dad's side, 2 on my mum's side, who went and lived in Australia, and they've lived there all their lives. Most of them. One of them came back to New Zealand for a little bit, but generally speaking, they were in that period, and they were what you would describe as the brain drain. They were all pretty educated. They'd come through. One was an architect, and one was a carpenter, and one was a food scientist. So
not too many come the other way, do they?
Well, most of them are returning New Zealanders.
Yeah, true.
That's what most of them, in the stats. And that's, I guess, one of the key points here is that you hope they come back. The big worry at the moment, and this is something that Professor Paul Spoonley, who studies this sort of thing, he's an expert in population. He's a population
demographer dude, isn't he?
Yeah, he's very worried. He thinks that the ones that are leaving at the moment are in their 30s, that they are skilled, that they are nurses, doctors, police, and we know the Australians are trying to recruit those.
They aggressively recruit, don't they?
They do.
Shamelessly recruit.
Well, they can
police,
offer that more
nurses.
money.
Yeah.
Now, let's get to the. We'll whip through the 1980s and get into the 2000s because it starts to get interesting politically.
Can we talk about the underarm at any point?
we're in. Well, we could actually.
Oh, yeah, we're in the 80s. So anyway.
Well, Muldoon talked about it, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean,
he said it was appropriate that the Australians were wearing yellow when
he had some good lines, didn't he?
Rolled the ball down at the MCG. 1980.
Well,
81.
and actually, I can remember that sitting on the couch watching that as a young fella. I mean, it did hurt. It did sting.
I think that's why. You asked me at the top of the show, mate, why I'd never gone to, wanted to work in Australia. That might have been part of it. I think I was 11.
I think you're probably right, actually. I think we're digging at something deep in our psyches here, guys. 80s through to the 2000s. Look, I've got to skip through because obviously it's a big period. But you think of Rogernomics. The one thing I might ask you about here is for your thoughts on was New Zealand went pretty hard and fast on neoliberalism. That's pretty well documented. The Australians went a bit slower.
Yep.
The Australians were more measured in their opening up of the economy.
Yep.
We had much higher unemployment as a result. We did get productivity growth, and things did start to improve in some areas. But I think from my sort of looking at that period through to 2001 from the 80s was that, again, it fluctuates up and down a bit, but the average is still, you're still getting that net loss. And I think, Australia perhaps just handled that period better? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, not many people nowadays argue that we should still own tourism companies and chateaux, and I think we used to own the Listener at one point. I don't think that many people argue that we should go back to what life was like before the 1984 Rogernomics revolution, where you needed a prescription to get margarine because you weren't supporting the farmers and butter, and any other number of examples that you want to use. But the main criticism that seems to hold is that we just did it too fast. And I think most relevant to this conversation possibly is slightly beyond Rogernomics, but still the same shadow of it, is the Employment Contracts Act of, I think, 1991 under the Bolger government. Where you really did break the unions down. And look, I've got no candle for the unions, I'm not arguing that, but you'd know this, the Aussie unions are still and have been very strong, and they fight for very strong wages and conditions. And I remember even interviewing Jim Bolger for a series we did called The Ninth Floor, where we went and interviewed all the living prime ministers at the time, and we did a series on it. And one of the things that Jim Bolger said to me, and it made quite a bit of news at the time, was he thought that unions were too weak in New Zealand, and we'd gone too far with this, and they didn't have enough leverage. And I don't know, I can't prove it, I haven't read it, you'd probably know more than me on this, but I wonder whether part of the equation there with the Aussies and wages was the power of leverage of the unions.
There's no question that the unions in Australia are still stronger, and that has certainly been one of the arguments here from unions here, hasn't it? That when you look at that wage gap debate, they have long argued that labour conditions have been a factor in that.
Yeah. The other thing I'd add to that, and your brother Liam Dan from the New Zealand Herald bangs on to me about this quite a bit, is compulsory compulsory superannuation in Australia.
Well, that's another whole context.
It is. It's a whole show, brother. But he reckons that is one of the main reasons why Australia is richer than us, because they have that. But anyway.
Yes, and we could go right back to Muldoon again on that one, couldn't we?
And we will, because he cancelled
one of us will do that at some point. We'll make that promise.
Because he cancelled compulsory super
scheme.
So
let's just rock into the 2000s here, because you mentioned this earlier on. So we know that New Zealanders up until 2001 were able to go to Australia, and they had a bit of a stand down, but they could get the dole, they could get some help, they could set up their lives, they could get on with things, and it was all great. But in 2001, as you say, the Aussies start saying, "Hey, this is costing us $1 billion. We're not happy about this." By all accounts, they were apparently worried about the issue of people using New Zealand as a launching pad or a lily pad. Well, that's right.
This third country issue that they felt that they had, that you would bounce in to New Zealand with the idea of hoping to end up in Australia.
Yeah,
that was their concern.
So Helen Clark cuts a deal with Howard.
Yeah,
you may remember this. This was 2000.
Controversial. I remember covering it.
Yeah. So she does a press conference with Howard, and she says basically her argument is, we've got to bite the bullet here. We might not like it, but we've got to do this. So it suddenly makes it a lot harder for New Zealanders to get citizenship in Australia and to get those benefits and to get those rights. Now, some reports from Infometrics was one, and others have suggested this did have some impact on the numbers of New Zealanders and on that brain drain, because suddenly it was less attractive to go. But if you look at the numbers, the average over that period going over the early 2000s, it's still up around 30,000, net loss. The net loss is still pretty strong. So it may have had some impact, but we were still certainly losing a lot of New Zealand citizens to Australia over that period. And it carries on. And then, as you alluded to at the beginning, we get towards the 2007 election. And there have been some good years under the Clark government towards the back end of their administration. The economy had some reasonable growth. If you think of those years when Cullen was banking big surpluses and this sort of stuff. So in those periods, New Zealand tends to not worry so much about the brain drain, does it? Well, then along comes John Key.
Yeah.
and then he stands up in a stadium. So let's play the clip and then you can talk about it.
We're here today at Westpac Stadium. It holds nearly 35,000 people. And believe it or not, the equivalent of this entire stadium and more leaves every year to permanently live in Australia. They leave in part because the wages and conditions are better in other countries. And I'm convinced we can do a lot better than that. I'm convinced we can give them a reason and a purpose to stay in New Zealand.
Doesn't he sound young too? It's amazing how voice changes over time, eh?
And not overly
unmistakably John Key, but he sounds a lot younger.
And not overly dramatic, was he? He was just sort of calmly laying it. That's one of those ads that stuck, you know.
Oh, big time! It did.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm a guy who calls the Christchurch Stadium that I watched Richard Hadley bowl right arm and bat left-handed in Lancaster Park. So
yes,
I can
right.
always forget the branded naming rights. But is that Wellington Stadium? What I'd call the Cake Tin.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's not called Westpac Stadium now. It's called Sky Stadium, I think. It's probably been through about 4 names before that.
yeah. Makes you wonder why they pay so much when no one can remember what the branding is. But that would have been the 2008 election campaign, wouldn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And that, I think, that clearly was a very effective strategy. Again, harking back to those echoes of Muldoon there, where and the pressure that goes on politicians when the brain drain spikes up and people start losing their cousin or the brother or the uncle says, I'm off, I'm over to Aussie. Oh, it's beautiful weather over in Gold Coast, and starts to play on that psyche a little bit. And he was very effective, I think, at that. That was a very effective ad campaign.
It was. I imagine if you lay it over your graphs of who was leaving New Zealand, there'd be a pretty, positive relationship, wouldn't there, between problems in the New Zealand economy and those leaving. In other words, when New Zealand's economy is not prospering at all, people leave. And,
absolutely right.
They're
and I think
highly motivated by that,
if that's one of the big takeaways people do need to have from this, is that clearly, economic fortunes do have an impact. So Key comes in, right, and all of a sudden he wins, right? So the pressure's on him now to come up with a way. How are they going to close this wage gap, which is 20-25%? Sometimes during the course of that period, it was like $500 more a week that the Australian was earning for an equivalent job. There was all sorts of numbers I was looking at, and it was pretty clear. So comes up with funnily enough, as you say, the 2025 project. Let's have a listen to one of the MPs from the ACT Party who was involved with that.
We can carry on like we are and get all these freebies from government, if you like, and say, well, isn't that great? But if you accept that, don't expect to have your children and grandchildren necessarily staying in New Zealand, because they'll be finding themselves a far better job and better prospects in another country, possibly Australia.
You know who that is, don't you?
Yeah, that's Rodney Hyde, last seen on Reality Check Radio. He was the ACT Party leader at that time, and he'd done a deal from memory with Key that he would have this 2025 task force. And did he appoint Don Brash to lead that? I can't remember.
Yes,
did he?
Yes,
Am I
it was
right
Brash.
on that?
Yep, you're right.
Yeah, and just a quick war story on that.
Yeah, no, I want to hear this.
So they come up with this report, right? I was political editor at TVNZ at the time in Wellington, and I thought, I want to get this yarn first. And so I convinced someone who will still remain nameless to give me the key parts of this. Effectively got leaked most of the document. And from memory, it was, it was a slash and burn sort of, re-ignition of Rogernomics sort of stuff. I mean, it was basically sell all the assets. From memory, a flat tax that Douglas
I think it was 25 cents.
25%, something like that. It was a real neoliberal bonfire sort of approach. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. And I got hold of Key, who was overseas somewhere at the time, and he came back to me straight away and he said, none of it's happening. He killed it stone dead. And so the first that ACT had found out about it was basically I went live on the telly that night and said, the thing's gone, it's a dumpster fire, it's not going to happen, it's all over. And that's interesting for a number of reasons too, because
yes,
Key,
it is.
he's hardly a hand-wringing right-ringing lefty, but God, he knew, didn't he, where the political pulse was, where the radar was, which way the wind was blowing. He knew that Kiwis weren't going to.
Man, he must have had some leverage to do that, or some confidence to just outright do that.
Interesting you say that for context, because, would Luxon do that today with Peters and Seymour?
Not in that way.
No, he wouldn't. And part of it, that is just maths, eh? So back in those days, Key had won government with, 46, 47% in all his elections. So the ACT or United Future or Te Pāti Māori at the time were just little dashes in the cocktail rather than, half a glass or a third of a glass. So, he had the leverage to do that, and he totally put ACT in its box over that and said, nah, it ain't happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. So if we skip through his, funnily enough, we actually saw one of the peaks of brain drain numbers. I think it was up around 44,000 or something in 2012. So you could argue, well, Key wasn't that successful, but strangely at that period he didn't come under the same pressure, even though unemployment in New Zealand
peaked at about the early sevens, didn't it?
And often was around 5.5%, 6% during his period, but there was a sense that New Zealand was doing was somehow more wealthy, and that came through very strongly when an Australian economist actually talked up the New Zealand economy. And let's see if you can help people with the context from this. I'll play the clip.
We think New Zealand's growth is going to pick up pretty solidly this year. We think it's going to outperform almost all of the OECD economies. There's a couple that are going to keep ahead of it, but we think it really is going to be the rockstar economy.
That's Bloxham. I can't remember his first name.
Well done.
Yeah, it's Bloxham.
Paul Bloxham, yeah.
Paul Bloxam. HSBC at the time.
I think he was at HSBC at that time.
Yeah, the rockstar economy. And they loved Key over there too. Because Key in English who was a finance minister, just for people who don't remember, because of course they came in at a time where the GFC was in full swing, the global financial crisis, things were really tough. And Bill English, finance minister, and John Key, Prime Minister, were seen to have done a fairly good job of pruning the economy back. They had zero budgets where they didn't spend any money. You just had to reprioritise everything. But they were seen to have done quite a good job of pruning carefully. And as they got a bit of momentum along, New Zealand was seen as a rock star economy. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the big features that was actually in the interests of this conversation was immigration, right? Immigration to New Zealand.
Yeah. We certainly started seeing much more of that coming through because the economy was hotter, and the Australian economy too wasn't doing quite as well. One of the things that under so many threads to this, it's impossible to get to them all. One of the threads with the Australian economy has often been the mining boom, and they had a very strong in the early 2000s and the early part of the century, a very strong mining boom that had come off a little bit around 2014, and suddenly we were doing better than them, and so they were looking at us going, "Hey, these Kiwis are going all right." So we were starting to get some good press. I'll just read, in fact, from the most recent statistics, Stats New Zealand said, look, traditionally there's been net migration loss from New Zealand to Australia. This averaged about 30,000 a year from 2004 to 2013, and then 3,000 a year from 2014 to 2019.
Wow.
So you can see in those numbers that when New Zealand is doing well, that there isn't quite the same drag. That certainly is a factor. Now, let's come back to the other thread in all of this, which is around citizenship. So we know the Aussies have cracked down and made it tougher. It hasn't really... it's hard to know how much impact that has had, but it's been a massive irritant. We had Kiwi lobby groups launching in Australia arguing that they didn't have rights. People over there growing up and their kids couldn't get student loans even though they'd lived there their entire lives, this sort of thing. And we get to, 20... Oh, I've lost my dates there. 2020, and Jacinda Ardern famously had a press conference with Scott Morrison. Let's have a listen to that clip.
Australia is well within its rights to deport individuals who break your laws. New Zealand does the same. But we have a simple request. Send back Kiwis, genuine Kiwis. Do not deport your people and your problems.
So she's over there really agitating. And then in 2020, and that was, if you remember, that was a big issue. And then in 2023, finally the Australians actually relent, not necessarily on that issue of the 501s, the sending people back. They are taking a softer approach there, but they have opened up an easier pathway for New Zealanders now. 2023, Chris Hipkins signs that. So we've come full circle here. It now is a little bit easier for New Zealanders to go to Australia and become a citizen under the new rules. And you start to wonder, is that going to, again, be another draw card, or is it simply going to be the fact that our economy, again, at the moment, is weaker than the Australians? They've got lower unemployment. Their economy is in a better position. And then I just want to throw one last thing as we wrap this up. When we try and define the brain drain and this idea of a brain exchange, Treasury actually, there have been a lot of studies on this. Treasury looked at it, all sorts of people. And one of the things they say is that the migration to Australia is not necessarily a brain drain because anybody from New Zealand can go, whether you're skilled or unskilled, or whether because the people.
So is it just that it rhymes? I mean,
Look. On the one hand, it's clear that we lose nurses and doctors, and we do lose some of those, but then we pick them up from elsewhere. So there's a brain exchange. They come in from other countries into New Zealand, and we've been doing that. So you could argue it's a circular thing, and then they argue, well, those who go to Australia, some of them are just straight out of school, or we haven't spent thousands of dollars training them necessarily, because anyone can go and work in the mines or whatever. That was their
Does
argument.
Russell Crowe count in any of this?
Yes. He's probably, I agree, he's probably your most famous exponent of the brain drain, isn't he? Because he left. Yeah. There have been a few others, but he's one that certainly jumps out. But I think I might see, if we're going to finish now, and I might just see if there's a few vox pops floating around from some Kiwis out there about why they go and why they don't go, because, it's worth remembering why people don't go and why they come back, because of their family, because of their roots, as the song goes. So whilst there's clear economic trends and threads and context to all of this, you do have to, I guess, not forget your roots.
These Kiwis, the grass isn't greener.
Australia's way too hot and it's too much drama there than New Zealand.
I think I would stay in New Zealand. We've got plenty of water here and lots less things that want to kill us.
I was offered about 1.7 times what I would earn here in New Zealand to go straight over to Aussie.
But what do you like about New Zealand?
What I love about New Zealand is the people and the culture.
Oh, we've got the most beautiful scenery in the world, great people, and a wonderful future. I'd stay here.
And it's nice, isn't it?
I laugh because it resonates with me about creepy things that want to kill you, because especially talk to my daughter like that. That's one of the things.
You don't have to worry about a thing here besides a few mosquitoes, do you? And one last thought, because weather is probably a factor for some people who do want warmer climates. They go to the Gold
you're in
Coast.
Wellington, brother, so that's...
A lot of people go to the Gold Coast, don't they, because they want that warmer weather, particularly older New Zealanders. And look, fair enough. But I did read the other day that someone saying that an Australian who had said that they were buying a summer house in Queenstown because they couldn't handle the heat in Australia. Wow. So, with climate change and the way the world's going, maybe the brain drain will come the other way.
And maybe you'd need a salary at least 35% higher than New Zealanders to afford that.
Well, that is true. Now, that is us. That is context for this week. Thank you, Guy, and thank you, everyone, for listening. We will be back again next week.